Welcome everyone, welcome to this webinar today, who we're very grateful to Emma Millar from Taylor Vinters, who's going to be looking at legal structures, and thank you to all of you who answered the questions that we had at registration, which has helped give us a little bit of a steer on the type of things you're looking to get out of the webinar. Those of you who don't know a huge amount about SEEE, we're Social Enterprise East of England, and we're a membership organisation for all types of social enterprises in the East. We've got a real mixture of members from community businesses, traditional social enterprises, co-ops, KICs, charities as well, a real mixture of different types of social ventures as the board term. And you can join us for free if your turnover is under 100,000. And we've got a joint membership with Social Enterprise UK. So it means you get benefits with us and also the national organisation. So you can have a look on our website to find out more about that. These webinars we've been doing more during the pandemic, obviously, and later on in May we're going to have a week of webinars, which is a follow-up to a similar thing we did last autumn, which went really well. So keep a look out on our social media, we'll have some more details soon. So that's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Emma. Thank you ever so much, Emma, and we'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Yes, no, not a problem. Very happy to be here, and thank you to everybody for carving some time out of your morning to come and hear me talk about social enterprises. So just to give you a little bit of background, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Taylor Vinters, we are a law firm with offices in Cambridge, London, Oxford and Singapore. Where we position ourselves is very much working with entrepreneurial individuals and the innovation economy more generally. My practice area is working with charities and other social enterprises and not-for-profit organisations. I've done that for a number of years, and tend to see all manner of queries and the life cycle of those types of organisations, from very early startups right through to exits or mergers, or obviously in some cases winding up if that's the right option. I will be involved with commercial issues, be they sort of contract drafting, governance issues, or larger transactional matters, incorporations, mergers, as I mentioned, that sort of thing. So anything and everything that has a bit of a not-for-profit flavour will probably have crossed my desk at some point. And I have to say I love it. It's a great sector to be working in, and keeping abreast of what's happening more generally with the sector is something that we're very keen to do as well. So I'm going to, hopefully technology will allow, move on to sharing our slides. Here we go. Hopefully everybody can see those. And I will run through what we will be discussing today. So there's me. So the outline for today's session, and I think this does address some of the questions that have been raised in advance. So hopefully you'll get some useful takeaway points there, but you'll see I have built in some specific time to have discussions and questions. So if there is anything that you think hasn't been covered, or something that comes to mind whilst we're speaking, then do feel free to either use the chat function, and perhaps I will try and keep an eye on that, but if we don't, we'll definitely sort of look at that specifically at the end, or once we're at that point, as I say, feel free to take yourselves off mute and just shout out at me, and we can address things then. So what we're looking to cover today, starting off at the beginning with what a social venture is and why people look to set them up, then moving on to the nuts and bolts really of what that might look like in terms of putting a legal wrapper around that entity and starting normally a company to take that venture forward. Some key questions and typical models in the sector, a bit of a legal shopping list for what you might need to think about when you are getting started, and what can give you the best grounding for functioning at that time. And as I say, then just a little bit of free time to wrap things up. So hopefully that all sounds useful for everybody, and we will kick things off. So here we are. Here are a selection of not-for-profits and social ventures that you might be familiar with. Some of these, as I say, are some very big hitters in the economy and on everybody's radar, really. So I have to say most of these pictured here Allbirds, Tom's, Patagonia, they're all B Corps, which you might be familiar with. But there are a number of other organisations and structures. So the real takeaway point from this slide is that a social venture can do anything, really. If it has an underlying social driver, social or environmental, then it can be out there, it can be doing something. So these are, as I say, some very well-known examples that most people will be familiar with in some sense, but some of the social venture companies that I work with, for example, there is a community interest company that I work very closely with that has developed teaching programs for working with children with autism and other learning disabilities. And they use a sort of franchise and license model to train other individuals to take that training out to other professional settings or parents. I work with another social venture that uses satellite technology and artificial intelligence to monitor and prevent illegal fishing. We work with another that has developed a specific type of technology that does sort of peer-to-peer sharing in a very sort of encrypted way. Another that is a community interest company again, but this one has a particular piece of technology enshrined to look at biodiversity for farming practices, and they have a membership that has access to that technology. So the upshot is that if you've got an idea and you think there's a social driver behind it, then by all means get out there and do it, and we can certainly look to capture the driver of what you want to do in a legal way that makes that work for you. It's a really flexible model. And I just wanted to share a little quote here that I think really nicely encapsulates the mission of what social ventures set up to do. So this is Karen Lynch. She's the chief executive of Bellew Water. She's also the vice chair of Social Enterprise UK. Great speaker if you do ever have the chance to see her at an event, but she's got this quote, which I just think is lovely. So, we must try to influence everyone running a business that there is a better way to do business. Rather than get rich and then solve the world's problems, why don't we combine the two and through the course of business, rather than charity, each make a positive difference? Now, I work with charities, as I mentioned, and I think they absolutely still have a place. They've been there for hundreds of years in some senses, working with beneficiaries from the ground up, and bringing awareness to these issues. But the downside of that is they do have an additional regulatory burden, which particularly some more entrepreneurially minded individuals find a little bit limiting. And I think that's the really nice space where social ventures can come to the fore, because they do have that degree of flexibility to be able to address these problems, perhaps on a slightly more sort of fluid footing. So the social venture scale, what are we talking about when we're looking at these types of organisations? We are, if you'll see the diagram here, we've got charity on the one side and purely profit generating businesses on the other. Social ventures occupy this space in the middle. It's a very broad brush, as you'll see. It's a wide scale because there is a lot of variation in the nature of these businesses and the extent to which their operational models affect the amount of private benefit that might be derived from their activities, be that dividend payments to individuals or, in some senses, an exit generated when perhaps if you have private investors coming on board and look to sort of sell on or commercialize certain aspects of what the company is doing. What is a social venture? There is no absolute definition, but I do think that this equation does give a good summary. So essentially we are looking at a social purpose, be that social in terms of beneficiaries from individuals or an environmental purpose. An entrepreneurial approach, I think you want to tackle a problem and look at it a little bit differently to perhaps the way that a registered charity might do or other commercial businesses, because you want to combine the two in a sense, and that really gives you the output of a social venture. it tends to be those businesses that identify and demonstrate some of the following factors. So they will say, we'll have an enshrined social or environmental mission. They are reinvesting and directing surplus profits back towards that mission, either back into the company in order to allow it to grow and develop further, or they will be diverting that to some community benefit or environmental project that furthers their social mission. They are independent of government, so we're not looking at quangos and things like that. And they are business driven. They are primarily earning income through their trading activities, and they are not wholly reliant on grant funding. Ooh, there we go. So some key questions for looking at starting a social venture. You'll see this little diagram here. So I think these are the sort of main 5 takeaway points for me that I would suggest anyone thinking of looking at setting up a social venture considers. So taking it from the top, governance, I think some questions to think about are: how regulated would you like your organisation to be? Will your particular venture gain any credibility from having external regulatory oversight, supervision, stakeholders in that sense? If we think back to the previous diagram where we were looking at the one side of charities, which obviously are very closely regulated by the Charity Commission that pushes out a lot of guidance and does monitor activities quite closely. And then on the flip side, you have Companies House, which is the company regulator, but is very much really just a gatekeeper. As long as you file your annual requirements with it, to be honest, there's nobody really checking what's being submitted in that sense. And then you have a whole range of things in the middle that's encompassing the social venture landscape. So for example, community interest companies, I would say, are more closely aligned on the charity side, because they do have the community interest regulator who will sort of expect some sort of impact measurement. We'll touch on this a bit more later, but other organisations like, for example, Social Enterprise UK, if you are looking to have their accredited mark, they will expect some proof, for example, of a certain percentage of profits being reinvested back into the building or business, sorry, or in furtherance of your purpose. Thinking about people, I think it's great to think about who will be involved at the outset. One of the key questions is control. So how much control do the founders want or need to retain going forward? If this is a passion project for them, if this is something where they have a really clear vision about where they want to take the company going forward, then you would assume that they would want to take a very high-level role steering the organisation from a strategic point going forward. But then you do need to think about whether there is anybody else that you need to bring on board. If you are looking at scaling up, do you need to incentivise executive staff? What about a wider pool of employees? That's not going to be right for every model, but some organisations do feel that they want to have a wider group of employees involved, and further down the line they may want to consider things like share option pools to keep those staff incentivized in working for the organisation. How will you fund the venture? Really crucial. Obviously it's great to have an idea for where you want to take this, but if there's no money behind to allow you to realise it, it's not going to get very far, in short. So thinking about where that money will come from. Are you looking at grant trading or equity investment? In terms of grant funding, who might be a good funder that is aligned with your mission and vision for where you want to take the entity going forward? In terms of trading, do you have any sort of built up goodwill? Have you sort of been doing things in the background that you can really sort of ramp up? Or equity investment, again, there's a question of whether you look at traditional VC in some senses, or investment with a more sort of entrepreneurial but also social flavour. There are a number of operators in that space, Mustard Seed, for example, being one of them, that are really sort of looking to straddle the social venture and investment space. So they're coming at that with a longer term view and a more holistic view, I think, looking to invest in companies for the longer term and be there for the scale up, rather than just looking at a sort of particular sort of exit figure 3, 5, 10 years further down the line. In terms of intellectual property, always useful to think, is there any valuable IP that's sitting behind the idea of the venture? Who owns this? When and how was it created? And if there is that sort of IP, how would you want to deal with that going forward? Are there opportunities to license that IP to other individuals or companies to further expand your reach and operations, or be a source of income for you going forward? So that sort of licensing arrangement. Or equally, actually, is it important for you to ring fence that IP because it has value for your external stakeholders, and that's the people who it's for the benefit of, and that you need to protect and maintain going forward? And finally, and by no means last, because this is huge, purpose. So really crystallizing what it is that you want to achieve, what's the purpose of the venture, who are you benefiting, and one of the outputs of that is how you will be measuring the impact of your organisation going forward. Now, I know SEEE has a great product that they've just launched here in terms of helping organisations think about that, because that is a really complex question as to how you monitor your outputs, what sort of information and data you need to be collecting, and how you take that going forward. But to distill that into 2 very simple takeaway points, normally social ventures will have and monitor their impact in one of 2 ways. One is you may have an organisation that effectively can sort of outsource its impact, if I can put it that way. So to give you an example, the company Babies with Love, which some of you might have heard from, they make children's wear, baby clothes, toys, etc. They donate all of their profits to a registered charity, SOS Children's Villages, which is fantastic. But in that sense, the impact of that social venture is effectively being outsourced to the registered charity, because they're the ones down on the ground that are then obviously working with beneficiaries globally, setting up these communities, raising children, etc. So it's absolutely on point and aligned with the products that sit behind from Babies with Love for a start, but also the passion that the founder has in wanting to make the world a better place. But they personally don't have to oversee the impact of that. As I say, that's with a regulated charity that is overseen by the Charity Commission, has its separate board of trustees, and is obviously doing everything above board in that sense. The other option is, and it entirely depends on the nature of your social venture and the business that you are operating. But to give you another example, Luminary Bakery, which again some of you may have heard of, it's getting quite a bit of traction in the press recently, is a bakery based in London that looks to take on women who are unemployed, who have suffered domestic abuse, or are otherwise disadvantaged, perhaps because of they come from a different immigration status or background. It's looking to upskill those individuals, obviously, in training them up to be pastry chefs. It offers employment courses, but it also has a wider mission, I think, of counselling, training, that sort of, again, holistic approach to these individuals. So its impact is much more measurable to the outputs that the bakery is delivering. So it's how many people have we got through the doors doing our course, what's their longer term ambitions once they leave us, how many of them are in training or employment. So there's some very sort of measurable statistics there that they can take away to put out to the wider world as to what their direct impact is. So as I say, entirely depending on the nature of your business, you will probably fall into one of those 2 categories in terms of recording your impact. So looking to get into some of the nitty-gritty here, legal structures and starting a company. So there are a few options you might have for looking to start a social venture. Excuse me. Some of these I will just talk about in very broad brush terms because, to be honest, they are not common at all. But just to give you an oversight so you're aware if you hear these terms or just want to make an informed decision as to what might be the best course for you. So a partnership where two or more individuals carry on a business in common and they have a view to making a profit from that business. One of the crucial things there is that a partnership is not a separate legal entity. So the individuals forming the partnership have unlimited liability. Essentially, they are the company and they are on the hook for whatever it does or does not do. A limited liability partnership, very similar to a partnership in the sense of individuals coming together for a shared vision, but it does have a separate legal personality. So there's just a little bit of a external shell around that allows it to function as an independent entity. The background governing documents to that are a members' agreement between those people forming the limited liability partnership. Community benefit societies are formed primarily to benefit people who are not members of the society, but it must be in the interests of the community at large. Profits used to further the society's aims and not distributed to members. It's a little bit of a quirky legal offering, really, actually, because it's overseen by the Financial Conduct Authority rather than Companies House or a sort of more bespoke regulator, if I can put it that way. Yeah, not very common is the upshot. And then a private limited company, which is by far the favoured vehicle for most social entrepreneurs. And there's a few reasons for that. Why they're so popular. Again, we've got 5 main points to run through there. It's relatively simple and cheap. So an online application to set up a charity is currently £12 with Companies House. So there's no real barrier to going ahead and doing this. In terms of timeframes, it would typically take 3 working days to have a company application set up and a company registered. Companies House do also offer a 24-hour same-day service if you were in a real hurry to get something up and running. It's well established and a respected legal structure. Everybody that you come into contact with and might be dealing with will know and feel comfortable in engaging with a company. So it provides a degree of credibility and prestige to your offering. And it does also have a suggestion of permanence. And as I say, there's a whole body of law that sits behind it that will support how you regulate the governance of the company going forward. It has a separate legal personality, so you can sit behind it a little bit in a sense that it's not your individual assets that are on the line for anything that the company does. It can sue and be sued in its own name. It can borrow money in its own name. It can enter into contracts. It can engage staff. So really, as I say, it just provides a little bit of a buffer between you as individuals and what you are going out to the marketplace to do. And we've also touched on the limited liability point there for individual directors and shareholders. So liability in a limited company will be capped at the amount that is unpaid on any shares or a guarantee in the case of a company limited by guarantee, and those are normally nominal sums, really. So there is not a lot that's personally at stake for individuals in these types of situations, and a huge amount of flexibility. Is separate ownership and management. You can separate out who your directors are from who your shareholders are, and I will go into that in more detail shortly. But if that's helpful for you to, for example, engage external stakeholders in that way, you can do that. Equally, if you want a closed structure where your directors and shareholders are the same individuals, then you could do that as well. So types of companies. if you're thinking of going down that route for a social venture, you have two options to consider, limited by guarantee or limited by shares. It's a really important decision to think about at the outset because it is irreversible. So you can't flip between the two. If you set up one and then decided that actually it really didn't work for you, you would need to wind up that particular entity and set another one up. So which is entirely possible, but it's a lot of administrative work that possibly could be avoided if we consider this at the outset. So private limited company by guarantee, it has members as opposed to shareholders, and will still have directors. It operates more like a charity, so most large charities will also be companies limited by guarantee with a top-up registration with the Charity Commission. It has an absolute limit on profit, so there is nothing that is able to be extracted from the company for private benefit above and beyond, say, for example, reasonable expenses for your directors if you so choose to go down that route. But any key assets that are held by the organisation, be they cash in the bank or IP, either need to be sold, transferred, etc., for full market value, and then that profit reinvested back into the business, or if you had a winding up situation, all of those assets would need to be passed on to another asset locked body, normally that's operating in a similar field to the company in question. So there's no leakage in that sense of private individuals being able to take any funds or assets out of the company. The contrast to that is a private company limited by shares, where you have shareholders as opposed to members, but you will also have directors who will be responsible for the strategic direction of the company. As a company with shares, it does, on the face of it, have ability to pay dividends to individuals. It can operate more like a traditional business in that sense. I think that the main point there actually though is there is still a lot that you can do with that model. So it's very much not a black and white distinction between if you want to be a social venture and you think you've got a really strong community purpose, you need to be a company limited by guarantee, because with a company limited by shares, there are still ways that we can lock down the assets to the organisation. I think that the main takeaway point there really is that it's just worth thinking really about what do you want to do with profits. If you want to distribute a percentage to yourself or other external investors perhaps, you would need to be a company limited by shares, because obviously there just is not that capacity in a company limited by guarantee. If you think in terms of scaling up in the future and future funding, you might want to issue shares to other private organisations or individuals by way of equity investment. Again, you would need to be a company limited by shares. If you think, in addition to your trading activities, really you're going to be very reliant on grant funding, you probably might be better thinking about a company limited by guarantee, again, because there is that absolute asset lock, and traditional grant funders certainly would probably feel more comfortable in funding a company limited by guarantee rather than a company limited by shares, although that's not to say it's impossible. So just to give you a little bit more background on the governance split between members and shareholders and directors. As I mentioned, directors are the individuals that have the day-to-day control for the operations and strategic management of a company. They have duties that are codified under the Companies Act, so to act in the company's best interests, etc. Members and shareholders have constitutional backstop powers, if I can put it that way. They do have some impetus over the operation of the company. So, for example, any change to a company's governing documents including a change to its objects or commercial driver, if that was built into its Articles of Association as the main governing document, would need to be approved by the majority of the members or shareholders. So as I say, those sort of backstop powers ultimately do sit with the company, and equally any decision to wind up a company, that needs to be taken and approved by the members rather than just pushed forward by the directors. So there's some important and powerful powers that those members and shareholders do have, but they're not there to micromanage the sort of day-to-day arrangements of the organisation. So the question then becomes as to whether you want or need an external body of people to act as your members and shareholders. That can be useful, as I mentioned, if you feel you need to engage with a wider group of stakeholders and they will want to feel like they have some ownership and skin in the game, in a sense, of what the company is doing. The flip side of that is if you feel actually from a streamlined decision-making point of view, you would like your managers and shareholders to be exactly the same individuals, because essentially then you've got the same people around the table that are making both decisions. They just might need to do that with a different hat, sometimes depending on what the resolution in question is. So thinking about some questions for starting social ventures, I'm going to go back to this slide because hopefully, given what we've spoken about for particularly the legal structures that you might have the option of undertaking, it can be worth going back and thinking, okay, I know a little bit more about what models might be right for me going forward. Let's then take a step back and think, how much regulation might I want? I'm going to take this venture forward. Is there anybody else who needs to come on board with me? Or perhaps you've got co-founders that you think taking this operation forward, in addition to, say, a salary, do we want additional benefits that we can take from this entity? Nobody, I think, really sets up a social venture because they think it's going to make them millions. That's not the main driver for it in these types of situations. But certainly some individuals do feel like they would like the ability to take dividend payments if and when the company is at a stage where it's making that sort of level of profits. Funding, particularly thinking about, again, where you might want to take the organisation going forward and what the purpose is. Is there an alignment with grant funding, or actually do we need to think about equity funding and shares? And as I say, really just, again, thinking about IP and purpose, touching base there. How are social ventures funded? There's a few options, and again, it will depend on whether you've adopted the limited by guarantee or limited by shares model. In terms of investment or debt, investment obviously is where investors will give you money in exchange for shares, so that is absolutely locked down to a limited by shares structure. Debt can be open to both a company limited by guarantee or a company limited by shares. So, for example, a bank providing a loan repaid at an agreed interest rate within a specific time period. And those type of arrangements will normally be secured against an asset, so you equally may have to give a personal guarantee for those types of loan arrangements. Revenue will generally be your payment for the goods or services that you are providing, and hopefully that's a fairly even stream of income for you. Grant funding from grant funders, well, there's been an interesting shift, actually, I have to say, in the recent landscape here, and I think it's fair to say driven by COVID to some extent. Traditionally, what we used to see was grant funding was very much program driven. It would be for a particular project, and the funder would have very key milestones. They would want impact reports along the way. What we're seeing now actually is a bit more flexibility, where grant funders will be happier to fund more general operational costs, which traditionally they never would. So I think that's a really helpful and welcome change. And I do think that a number of organisations are seeing the benefit of being able to request funding for paying staff, keeping the lights on, legal costs. I think that's a really useful thing to see. So if grant funding is of interest to you, by all means, feel free to sort of shop around, see who might be aligned with you in terms of your objects and your venture, but you may have a bit more scope to ask for something that isn't purely project driven, but that will depend on the individual terms of the grant funder. Just a couple of other things to note with grant funding arrangements is, as I say, there probably still will be impact reporting that would need to be measured, but that's sort of by the by of these social ventures. You'll hopefully be doing that anyway for monitoring your own purposes and activities. So hopefully that information will be readily to hand. The flip side of that for grant funders is that they will normally include the right that if they are unhappy with the progress of a program or content direction of that sort of impact reporting, is that they will have clawback provisions where they can request that money is repaid to them if, acting reasonably, normally they feel like the organisation is not quite taking the venture where they think it should be. Depending on who the funder is, you may be able to have a conversation there. Otherwise, perhaps you may just need to accept their standard terms and be prepared for that. But it's always worth reading the paperwork on that one to know what your obligations and their expectations are of that relationship. Crowdfunding is a newer one that we've seen gaining some more traction in the marketplace recently. Raising funding for normally a particular project, because that's the sort of hook that gets people interested in what you're doing, and normally raising smaller amounts but from a larger group of people, and in exchange for their pledges, funders can receive rewards, or sometimes it will be based around equity as well. So there's the opportunity for that to be open to guarantee companies or limited by shares as well. And licensing, franchising. Licensing particularly will really only be applicable if there is valuable IP in your organisation, be that materials that you are delivering, or perhaps if you have a particularly attractive brand, that's more the franchising side. But you could license out your IP in return for a fee that comes back to the company, and we would recommend that is recorded by way of a license agreement between the venture and whoever you are contracting with on that basis. Franchises, again, as I say, it's allowing another business to have access to your proprietary knowledge, processes, trademarks, and that franchisee will go off and sell a product or provide a service using the business's name that you've developed. And a very well-known example in that space is actually the McDonald's restaurant franchise. That's how they operate. So in some cases that will work for social ventures. It's not one that we see that commonly, but it's certainly an option there that can be used. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail now about the different models for social ventures that tend to be recognised in this space. Hopefully this is useful for you. I know there were a number of questions about community interest companies in particular. So yes, so going back to the initial diagram we had about charity on the one side, for-profit businesses on the other, we're now going to drill down into a little bit more detail about where these different types of ventures might sit on that scale. So as I mentioned earlier on, I would very much see community interest companies being really, to be honest, right up against charities. Community interest companies are set up for the benefit of the community, a nominated community. That is a lower threshold than the public benefit test for charities. And certainly the community interest regulator is not as hard in the registration process as the Commission is for registering KICs, but they do want to see that there's been some thought put into who your community will be, how you will benefit them, how you will measure the impact going forward. So it does need a bit of thought, and you need to know who your beneficiaries will be. A community interest company can be either a company limited by guarantee or a company limited by shares. Essentially, much like a charity, it's a top-up registration that you apply for on the top of the standard company that you have registered with Companies House. So you will be dual regulated in that sense. You will need to submit documents to Companies House, your annual accounts, your people with significant control. You will also need to record your impact assessment and submit that annually to the community interest regulator. So, as I say, you can have either company model sitting underneath a community interest company. The regulator does have some very useful template articles of association, which is the main governing document for a KIC, but you do need to choose the right one very carefully. I say this because there are 6 templates in all, so it can be a little bit confusing if you look on the website and you think, hang on, which one is right for me? So to go through that in a bit more detail, there are 2 options of template articles for a company limited by guarantee. One will be the closed company structure, so that is where your members and your directors are the same individuals. The other will be where you have a broader group of external members who are not your directors. So a fairly simple distinction, but you just need to get it right because it will affect the way, for example, that you call general meetings for your shareholders, who has the right to do that, who needs to have notice, etc. So it will sort of flow down into some practical considerations like that. We then move on to companies limited by shares, where there are 4 options of template articles. So this is split into what they call Schedule 2 companies and Schedule 3 companies. So Schedule 2 community interest companies, companies limited by shares that do not make any dividend payments to shareholders. Absolutely. So in that sense, they are company limited by shares, but they are completely asset locked. Nothing is coming out in terms of private benefit. And again, there is a distinction between whether you have a closed company structure where your members and directors are the same people, or you have a wider group of external members. We then move on to the Schedule 3 community interest companies limited by shares, which does permit dividend payments to private individuals, but it is subject to a dividend cap. Now, what this is that distributable profits by way of dividend payments are capped in a Schedule 3 KIC to 35%, which means that the remaining 65% of the business's distributable profits need to be either reinvested back into the KIC or used in furtherance of your nominated community. So you can give that to another non-profit organisation. You could put it into your grassroots community project, whatever it is, but it needs to be furthering your community purpose is the upshot. So there's a very sensible reason why that's there. We then move on to, yes, and I think I mentioned as well the annual reporting requirement to the CIC regulator. So in the KIC report, you would need to state what the KIC has done to benefit the community, whether it's consulted with key stakeholders on its activities, and if appropriate, the dividends that have been declared or proposed on any shares if you have gone for that Schedule 3 model. You may also need to record any assets that have been transferred to another asset locked body or at less than market value, which is something you can do, for example, if you were tying up with a charity or other KIC that was operating in the same space and you wanted to sort of share IP or that sort of thing, but not on a commercial footing. So moving on, we've got social enterprise next. There's no defined standard for what a social enterprise here is, but I'm going to take the Social Enterprise UK definition, and what they refer to there is a company that is reinvesting at least 50% back into the company or in furtherance of its social mission. So if you take that, we had the community interest company that had to put 65% back into the company or in furtherance of its social mission. SEEE UK's definition of a social enterprise, a little bit looser. We're looking at 50%, but still very much, as I say, significantly driving forward the social mission for the organisation. So certified social enterprises can apply to SEEE UK for membership, and as part of that membership, they will need to show that they meet that 50% criteria. There is a sliding scale of membership fees depending on the size of the organisation. So hopefully it's a price point that's accessible for everyone in that sense. There are some other players in that space as well. So there is the social enterprise mark, which is itself a community interest company. It holds itself out as being the only international social enterprise accreditation, and it differentiates itself by being slightly more independent, if I can put it that way, than SEEE UK, because it's not a membership body. And that has a process whereby you would need to review and reaffirm your status with the social enterprise mark every 3 years. So they have that sort of rolling impact assessment that they like to keep account of. One that's really coming on in leaps and bounds, I think, in terms of businesses signing up for it and seeping into the public's general knowledge is the B Corp movement. So started in the States, and yeah, gaining a lot of traction in the UK with businesses signing up. So it's an international movement for accredited social businesses. Why I've put that separately to social enterprises is because not all B Corps will meet the SEEE UK model of being a social enterprise. So there is no requirement on a B Corp to reinvest a certain threshold of profits back into the business or in furtherance of your social mission. It doesn't have that kind of cap. What it does do is that it requires a registered B Corp to amend its governing document, so it enshrines its social purpose in the driver of the company. It has to take account of wider social and environmental stakeholders and impact in its governing document, and it measures a company's entire social and environmental performance through an annual impact assessment. That focuses on 5 key areas, so governance, community, workers, environment, and customers. And a business has to score a certain number of points in an online survey before it would be eligible to hold itself out as being a B Corp. B Corp status is usually available to companies with at least 12 months revenue behind them, because it will ask about performance and issues for the past financial year. So it's not normally applicable to startups straight off the bat, although they do have a pending status that they are looking to roll out. So it's certainly, if you were interested in it, something to think about from the outset, because actually the way that you shape the governance of your organisation going forward, if you know that you want to aim for B Corp status, can be really useful to embed at an early stage, so you don't have to sort of reverse engineer that sort of thing going forward. But yes, it's you will, as I say, need to have or adopt governing documents that include their stated object wording. You'll need to ensure that board members are regularly taking account of a range of stakeholder interests. So that is considering employees, shareholders, suppliers, and regarding any impact that the business decisions might have on both the society and the wider environment. So it's very much sort of a higher consciousness to the way that you are doing business. Then we have pledging a percentage of profit. So that could be a company that, for example, just as a sort of gesture of goodwill, but something that they want to go a little bit further than perhaps sort of a charity of the year relationship, wants to say donate 10% of its profits to X charity. And again, that's the sort of way that an organisation might sort of outsource some of the impact and goodwill that it's generating in that sense. There are particular movements that are starting to pop up around this idea. One you might have heard of is 1% for the Planet, which is co-founded by the chap, I believe, that also started the Patagonia clothing company. But what that looks to do as a movement is pair up companies with charities that have sort of a similar alignment of values, and the company will donate 1% of its profits, whether it's profitable or not. So it's always that sort of baseline to a charity that is working with an environmental cause. And yes, it seems to be going great. I think recently I heard that they've expanded it as well to individuals. So for example, if you wanted to sacrifice 1% of your salary to charities that were working in the environmental space, then you would also be eligible to join up with this movement. And then obviously we move to a company operating in the normal commercial sense. So you can see there's a really broad range there of what people can do. There's a huge amount of flexibility. I would say one of the models that we have also been working with entrepreneurs to develop is more on the company side, in the sense that the underlying legal structure is a company limited by shares, but we are looking to enshrine an absolute asset lock and social purposes, but we're not going for sort of top up badging of B Corp or community interest company or social enterprise, really just to allow those entities to have the maximum degree of flexibility to operate the way they want to. And it seems to be working quite well so far. What we've seen in that particular model is that because of the absolute asset lock, we have been able to reassure certain grant funders that the organisations would be eligible for grant funding, because the operating model for these companies at the moment means that a lot of their projects are grant funded and normal trading income, but that might change in, say, 10, 15 years. So we have the flexibility that with a shareholder resolution or member resolution, we could unpick that a little bit and then open the company up in a more general sense to equity investment if the business model shifted enough to mean that that was necessary. My personal feeling is I probably doubt that would ever really be the case, because that's a much bigger cultural shift. But it's there as an option, which I think these particular sort of directors and entrepreneurs found quite appealing for their setup model. But yeah, so the upshot is probably one of these categories will fit the bill for what you are looking to do going forward. And by all means, if you're still not quite sure or think there are certain issues that you would like to bottom out in further detail, then please do feel happy to reach out, and we will always welcome having a discussion around what models might work for an individual. Yes, just to touch on a couple of bigger movements that are working in the sector as well. Some of these we have mentioned. So social enterprise certification from SEEE UK for businesses that trade with social purpose. So that's a really nice badge that people can put on their website or you know, their headed paper, etc., to sort of really hold themselves out as being a certified social enterprise. Tech for Good is a newer one, but again one that is gaining a lot of momentum in that sense. So it's a community of people, projects, organisations and funders that is looking to promote the role of technology in bolstering social, environmental and economic outcomes. It takes the idea that actually there is the possibility of bad tech that can sort of take away from the human experience and human drivers, and Tech for Good really wants to be open and accessible to all in the way that it is looking to address these social issues. It doesn't want to be the reserve of just those who know Java and C++, which I have to say I don't. So that's a really interesting one that's coming more to the fore. And B Corps, as we mentioned, I think is something that's really interesting, and you'll see actually a number of household names. So Ella's Kitchen, Jude's Ice Cream, even I think Danone, the yogurt people, are going for certification for certain bits of their business. So it's some really big names that are taking this forward. So legal checklists, what do you need to think about if you're at the point of setting up a social enterprise, or maybe something that just might need a little bit of a refresh and consideration, even if you have set something up. It's never too late normally to just go back and have a look through all these things. The fundamental document, and the one that we always need to start with, is your Articles of Association for a company, because this is the underlying governing document for any company, be it limited by guarantee or limited by shares. It will detail how many directors there are, what the quorum is for your decision-making process. What you'll need to remember is that this is a public document. It is published online with Companies House, and anybody can type in your company name and review this document. Also, any amendments that you make to the document during the lifespan of the company will need to be approved by the members or shareholders, as I mentioned, and will need to be filed with Companies House. So they will always need to have the most up-to-date version of your articles. There are some additional points that can be added for the benefit of social enterprises and that are unique to social enterprises. The main one would be embedding a social purpose to really enshrine your social or environmental aims within the company, within the constitution, and that way it's there front and center for everybody to see. It gives the directors direction for where they need to take the company, for the mission that they always need to keep in mind, and it can be beneficial for external stakeholders to be able to signpost them to the fact that this is the way I would express this is that it really gives you a bit more substance to the way that you are conducting your social operations, and nobody could then sort of suggest that this was a greenwashing exercise, because you've put it right there in the heart of your governing documents. So this is clearly very important to you as an organisation. And those wordings can be framed around things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That's quite popular for giving, again, a sort of external benchmarking for the mission that you might like to be conducting. As I mentioned, B Corps have their own prescribed wording for the social and environmental factors that they require their members to take account of. Another one that we sometimes see, as I mentioned, is the asset lock. It will be there by default for companies limited by guarantee, but for companies limited by shares, it is entirely discretionary whether you want to include that type of wording. And that is certainly something we can do if you want the flexibility to operate as a company limited by shares, but you still want to hold yourself out as a fully fledged non-profit in the marketplace and with your stakeholders. The benefit of that model, as I say, is you can do that, but then you don't have the sort of dual regulation that would come of being a community interest company or indeed a charity, but that may not be applicable. And dividend restrictions. So if you are a company limited by shares, you have a choice. If you are a community interest company and you choose that Schedule 3 model, then obviously you will have the dividend cap imposed, where you have the 65-35 split between dividend payments and distributable profits. But if you're not a KIC, it's entirely up to you. You could go for the SEEE UK model of just having an even 50-50 share between what's reinvested back into the business and what may be eligible for dividend payments, or any sort of sliding scale really in between that, and potentially allowing any distributable profits to be made by way of a dividend payment. So the application for a company is a very straightforward process. It can be done all online these days. So the first form is form IN01, as we see there. That requires you to set out details of who your members or shareholders will be, who the directors will be, what the guarantee or initial shareholding will be. And I would say, so for a company limited by guarantee, the normal guarantee figure is the nominal sum of £1. So whoever your members are will say, in the event of the winding up of this company, we agree to contribute £1 each. And I have to say, I have never ever seen a liquidator or insolvency practitioner insist on members digging £1 out of their pocket to cough up. For a company limited by shares, again, what we tend to see is a nominal initial shareholding, which again could be £1. The liability for the individual shareholders will be limited to the amount that's unpaid on any shares. So, for example, if you set up a company, the initial shareholding was £1 and you didn't pay that £1 to the company, your limited liability would be £1. If you paid that £1 for your share, your liability would be nothing because you've paid for your shares in full. And another tip from our corporate team is that if you think you are setting up a social venture and have a view to getting equity investment from VC, be that traditional VC or more social investment further forward, actually maybe think about having a smaller denomination for your initial shares. So rather than having shares of £1, have shares of 0.00001 pence. Because apparently it makes it easier to then sort of subdivide the shares when you have additional people coming on board as equity investors. But again, that's something that we could assist with if that was of interest to you. The incorporation fee for web filing is £12, and as I mentioned, we're looking at a very quick turnaround to get something set up. There's a couple of options there again as to how you can approach this. So if you really just want something set up straight away, so you can really crack on with starting to think in a little bit more detail about funding opportunities, where you take the business going forward, you can set up a company with what's called the model articles. So completely vanilla standard template that Companies House will issue. My caveat there is that I would say those model documents are not ideal for a social venture because they will not have any social impact or social object wording built into them. And if you want really to, as I say, have that front and center of your operations for your directors and any sort of other individuals to know, then I would recommend having a bespoke set of articles that can encompass that mission. The exception being if you decide that you want to be a community interest company, because you will need to include a social purpose as part of the template that are provided by the KIC regulator. My caveat there, as I say, is just to make sure that you are picking the right model document, because you've got those 6 options. So as long as you're clear on which one is right for you, that's fine. By all means, use the KIC model documents. That would be my recommended course of action for a community interest company, because I think anything that isn't one of those model documents is probably going to raise eyebrows from the regulator. So it's probably best just to go with what they suggest, and that way it's hopefully a smoother registration process for you. Company name is always useful to think about at an early stage. If you haven't been operating and don't have any goodwill vested in whatever you've been doing to date, then it's worthwhile having a little bit of a brainstorm to think what you might want to call yourself going forward. So checking availability, my starting points are always Google, just to see what other hits you have. Is anybody operating or coming up with a similar name? Companies House, I would always recommend checking as well, because charities may trade as something different to what's registered at Companies House. But if you found something that was registered at Companies House that was either the same or very similar to what you were looking to have for your own venture, the normal way that you would do that is, well, to be honest, the easiest way is just to pick another name. But otherwise, you would need to go to the person that has that name already and ask for permission to use that name. which if you're an entirely separate venture and have nothing to do with them, they're unlikely to grant. So yeah, worth getting thinking caps back on there. And another point as well is it's worth checking the Intellectual Property Office's trademark register. You can do that on their website. You can search trademarks. You can type in general keywords or phrases, and that will give you a hit list of if there are any marks that are registered that are the same or very, very similar to what you're looking to do. The upshot being is that really, if you can avoid it, you don't want to tread on any toes for businesses that are already operating in that space with a similar name, because you may find yourself on the end of a cease and desist letter, particularly if they have goodwill themselves or a particular presence in the marketplace. Another point also is to think about whether your name is overly descriptive for what you are trying to do. That might become an issue if you look to trademark your name at a future date, because the IPO may push back on registrations that are unduly prescriptive. There are also some special criteria around naming as well that's worth being aware for. So a community interest company must either use the name of the company and then CIC, or name of company, community interest company in full. I have a number of clients actually who quite like using the full name community interest company because they see it as a bit of a strap line to really sort of let the wider public know what they are, what they do, and the fact that there is this community thrust to their activities. Companies limited by guarantee do not have to use limited in their name. They can just have a shorter company name. And there are also some special requests and permissions that need to be obtained from Companies House or demonstrated if you are looking to use what they refer to as sensitive words. One that we sometimes see popping up for social ventures is if they want to use the word foundation in particular, because that obviously has connotations of being charitable. So that might just need a little bit of steering. Other things, if, for example, any sort of suggestion of royal is one that normally needs permissions from Clarence House, etc. And if you do want to think about trademarking your name in future, as I say, I've mentioned the prescriptive nature of it. The other thing to bear in mind is that trademarking is an expensive process. By the time you go through clearance searches and registration fees, and particularly trademarking will be based on particular classes of activity, so you will need to decide which classes of activity your business falls within, and also depending on whether you want to file just in the UK or more broadly internationally, because different jurisdictions will have different registration fees and requirements. And post-Brexit, whatever you have in the UK will no longer work as a community trademark in the EU. You would need to go through a separate registration process, which is unfortunate, but that's where we are. Another key agreement that can be useful to have further back, sitting privately within the company, is a shareholders or a members agreement. So if you're a company limited by shares, it would be a shareholder agreement, and that can regulate the way that shareholders act towards each other. It can be particularly helpful if you have 2 or more founders who are taking shares in a company, and you want to deal with, for example, what happens if one of them wants to leave further down the line. One point to bear in mind there is that if you are looking for equity investment going forward, don't worry too much about what your shareholders agreement looks like, because any investors coming on board, to be honest, will rip it up and want to impose their own terms anyway. But you might want something light touch just to regulate how those relationships function in the outset. For a members agreement, if you have a company limited by guarantee, where that's probably going to be most likely is if you do have a broader group of external members who are not your directors, because it will govern things like what rights they have. You can set out in more detail, for example, whether they have the ability to nominate or appoint board members. You may also want to consider building in things like wider conduct expectations, ensuring that your members are not bringing the company into disrepute or acting in a way that you would expect them to, in a sense, in their discussions and actions with the company, but also amongst themselves. So it's just to sort of make a more harmonious experience for everybody involved in the governance of the organisation. But that is a private document, so that's not publicly available at Companies House, and it's something that can be more easily amended. If you had wider shareholders or members, I would expect that you would seek their input to amend those terms, because obviously they are impacted by it, but technically those documents can just be amended by the directors of a company. So post setup, you've got a company, be it a KIC, or you've chosen to go for SEEE badging or as a B Corp. What other things might you need to think about to really get up and running and to be functioning as a business? So just to give you some ideas here, and this is by no means a definitive list, but this is the sort of shopping list that we see most often for those organisations that are starting to scale up and starting to become more established. Terms and conditions. So if you are providing goods or services to other organisations, you will want to regulate how you do that, your performance expectations, obligations, your payment terms, who has the right to change the scope of those services, very importantly, what those services are, so everybody knows exactly what the deliverables are. There are some other things that might come into play there. For example, so if you have a website, what are your website terms and conditions for individuals using your platform? Commercial agreements, you might be looking to outsource certain activities. So consultancy agreements is where we normally see that popping up. And there are some differences as to whether you might be engaging individuals as consultants or other companies. Employment, you may have executive staff sitting in director posts who are engaged by the company in that executive capacity. You might have a broader staff cohort. Equally, you may have volunteers that are coming on board, and how you regulate those relationships will all need a little bit of thought. Growth and investment. If, for example, you are looking at equity investment, you might want to think about term sheets, some sort of due diligence exercises that you undertake there. Equally, even for organisations that are likely to be grant funded, more often than not, you will be on the receiving end of the grant funder's terms, but just having some familiarity with those documents, knowing what to look out for, can be helpful in sort of fighting your corner for taking those relationships going forward. And you can't get anywhere without talking about data protection these days. So obviously we're all very au fait with GDPR now, it's been in place, but some particular agreements that you would need to have in place would be your privacy policy, your cookies, if you are entering into any processing arrangements with other companies. So for example, if you're outsourcing HR functions to another organisation, you're passing on staff data, you will need to think about the processing relationship and how you bottom out the obligations and regulatory expectations there. So I've talked for quite a while. I'm conscious of that. So I'd really love to open it up to those of us on the call now. If you feel like there's anything that we haven't quite covered, or anything else that's sort of popped up during the course of our discussion, me talking at you. So please feel free to unmute yourself, come on camera, say hello, and let's have a conversation.
Thanks, Emma. There were a couple of questions in the chat from Sandra. Sandra, I'm not sure if you want to say your question yourself.
Yeah, hello. I'm just starting the video as well, so you can see me. Yeah, basically, I was considering a CIC because I'd just got a little bit of information from some sort of local social enterprise agencies, and they mentioned the CIC, and I wasn't massively familiar with it. But actually, I think probably social enterprise suits me better, because I'm already running an existing sole trader for profit business, which is what I would like to convert. So my question is actually about, how would I go about converting it to a social enterprise? Do I have to close down my sole trader business and start afresh, or can I just transfer it across to a different model?
I think there are some accounting issues there that I would definitely recommend getting some external financial advice on, because I know the tax treatment for sole traders and self-employed arrangements in that sense are very different to the company trading and tax arrangements. So that's why I slightly hesitate, because I think that's one of the key issues that would determine the outcome of that. From a legal standpoint, no, you could quite easily set up a limited company and transfer your enterprise into that, and then choose whether you want to insert any of the sort of additional sort of bells and whistles, if you like, whether that be dividend cap, or whether you just want to go for B Corp status, SEEE UK accreditation, etc. And really then you've got the flexibility to work with that. You could take what you have now and also go for the top up sort of kick registration, but yeah, you need to bear in mind that that comes with a degree of more regulatory scrutiny and is, in my opinion, a little bit less flexible. So it's a trade-off there.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Thanks. I'll speak to an accountant next then.
I think that's definitely the next step. Yes.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Thank you. And I think we also had a question from Sam Fairbrother, although not sure whether Emma might have covered it. Sam, are you still there?
Yeah, yeah, kind of similar situation. I think I'm very much in the startup phase of my company, and it's kind of helping young people and university graduates into the creative industries. I've already set all my company up and everything as a limited company, and I was looking into the sort of the CIC model and things like that, and just where you're talking about getting SEEE UK registration to sort of be considered a social enterprise or social venture, would I have to change my company from limited to a CIC to do that, or is that just something you can kind of write a declaration for your company, like to say that you're going to do all these different things in order to kind of be considered a social venture, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so the way that I see that operating is that kick status is something separate to SEEE UK accreditation. Kick status is separately regulated, as I say, with a limited by shares company that you already have. You would need to impose, either sort of lock down the dividend distribution entirely, or if you did want to be able to take dividend payments from it, you would be subject to the 65-35 split. Whereas if you want to go down the route of SEEE UK accreditation, you would need to insert some wording around a 50-50 split of reinvestment of profits. The third option I would say is open to you, is embedding a social purpose in the governing document of your limited company, and not going for an external accreditation. And the way that works is that you then hold yourself out as saying, look, this is really important to us. Think about the wording and how you frame it, as I say, employability or opportunities for young people. I'd leave that to you, as I say, because you know best what you've been doing. But yes, that would the main takeaway there is no absolute crystallized definition of what a social enterprise is. So as long, I think, as you are sort of putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and the way I see companies doing that is embedding a social purpose in their articles, then you can hold yourself out as a social enterprise. You don't need to be a kick, you don't need to have SEEE UK accreditation. But what I would want to see from a sort of a credibility standpoint, I think, as much as anything, is to see that there is something that backs up the social driver for what you are doing. And the two ways I would recommend you do that is embedding a social purpose in your articles and impact. So monitoring what you're doing, who are you reaching, what are the outcomes of that, and how are you making a difference? Does that help?
Yeah, definitely, because I was kind of made aware that, you know, there's more funding available for CICs and social enterprises and things like that. So it's just trying to get my head around what I would need to become legally, I guess, to access extra funding or anything like that later down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think my thought was there shouldn't necessarily be anything that you need to change to your underlying structure. There is no reason why you could not still be a company limited by shares, and that does give you the maximum amount of flexibility. As I say, I think in order to really badge yourself as a social enterprise, it's just putting a little bit of substance and flesh on the bones as to how you do that.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
I think also to pick up on what you were saying, Emma, if I can give our SEEE a plug. So we've launched a toolbox, a social impact measurement toolbox just recently, which is really helped demystify the subject so that people can actually start measuring their impact from the word go and get into good habits and systematically, you know, record all different areas they're doing. And then later down the line, if they want to, you know, apply a specific reporting model to it, they can, but at least gets them started with measuring their impact. So that, you know, for your example, Sam, then if you are applying for funding, even if you don't have a particular, you know, kick structure yet or something, if you've got those articles set out and you show that you're, you know, actively recording your impact, you know, from the word go, you're already seen in good light. Would you agree with that, Emma?
I would, yes, yeah, absolutely.
Show you're serious and professional and, yeah, starting as you mean to go on, I guess.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
That's okay. Any other questions? I will send around obviously Emma's contact details, so that if any of you wanted to have a more in-depth conversation with Emma, then
more than happy to do that. Yeah, and one thing I would mention as well is you'll see on this slide we do have our virtual pop-ups that we offer for social enterprises. They are free 30-minute chats with either myself or some of my colleagues in our social ventures team, and we can very much have an initial conversation about whatever those issues are. We just ask you to fill in a form just to give us a little bit of heads up as to what you might want to talk about, and then we can take it from there. But that's an open offer to anybody on this call that might want to pick up on anything in further detail at another time.
that sounds great. Thanks, Emma, for that offer. That'd be really good. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and a huge thank you, Emma. That's so much information covered, and so that's been a brilliant webinar. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for listening.